He worked as an ordinary woodcutter and got a simple job: to cut down an old tree on the edge of the cemetery. Locals warned him not to touch that tree. What he discovered inside made the entire town shudder. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to comment where you're watching this video from. The wind came down from the hills in long, tired breaths, dragging with it the smell of wet leaves and cold iron. Late autumn had stripped the countryside of color. Only the dark branches of bare oaks and the faded grass along the roadside broke the monotony of gray. At the far edge of town, where the paved road gave way to packed dirt, a narrow lane led to the old cemetery. Beyond its leaning fence, a massive oak rose higher than the tombstones surrounding it, its trunk twisted and blackened with age. Locals said it had been standing there since before the town had a name, and that its roots ran through the graves like veins. That morning, Jonathan Cross parked his battered pickup at the cemetery gate. The engine idled a moment before he cut it off, leaving only the sigh of the wind. He sat in silence, watching condensation form on the inside of the windshield. 52 years old, his face marked by decades of work outdoors, Jonathan was a man accustomed to solitude. The death of his wife 5 years earlier had sealed that silence inside him like sap inside old wood. Work was all that remained. He cut trees for the city, cleared storm damage, trimmed power lines. The oak by the graveyard was his latest assignment, a dangerous one, but nothing he hadn't faced before. The letter from the municipal office still lay on the passenger seat. It said the oak's roots had begun to lift the old headstones, that rot was spreading through the trunk, that sooner or later it would fall, perhaps onto the graves or the road beyond. He was to remove it completely before the next winter storm. Simple instructions, bureaucratic in tone, stamped and signed. Yet, when he'd mentioned the job at the diner 2 nights ago, the reaction of the locals had been anything but casual. The old men who gathered around coffee and pie at closing time had all gone quiet at once. Then one of them, a thin man with hands like dry branches, had said softly, "That tree's older than our father's fathers. It grew out of a grave. You best leave it be." Another had muttered that someone once tried to cut it down, back in the 50s, and died in his sleep a week later. Jonathan had smiled, polite but unmoved. He'd heard worse. Every small town had its stories. Trees that bled, houses that whispered, ponds that pulled you under. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in chainsaws, leverage, and proper angles. But now, as he sat looking at the silhouette of the oak through the fogged glass, he felt a faint hesitation he couldn't explain. The thing towered above the tombs, its branches thick and interwoven, its bark ridged like scar tissue. Even from here he could sense its weight pressing into the ground, a stubborn monument to something forgotten. He stepped out of the truck. The morning was damp, the air smelling of moss and cold metal. Gravel crunched under his boots as he crossed the fence gate. Beneath his feet, the soil was soft and uneven, disturbed by decades of burials and the slow work of roots. He paused near a sunken grave where an old iron cross leaned sideways, half swallowed by the earth. The oak loomed just beyond, its lowest branches stretching over the fence like warning arms. For a moment, he thought he heard something, a deep creak, like breath drawn through the wood, but it was only the wind shifting through hollow limbs. He approached the trunk and laid his hand on the bark. It was rough, surprisingly warm, almost pulsing beneath the skin of lichen. Up close he saw the strange seams running vertically, as if separate trunks had fused long ago into one. At the base, the bark bulged outward around a dark scar, the shape of a closed wound. Jonathan traced it absently with his fingertips before stepping back. The tree would not be easy to bring down. Its crown spread unevenly. One massive limb hung toward the cemetery fence, another leaned over the access road. The wood, judging by its color, was dense but partially decayed. It would require careful planning, a directional cut, control lines, maybe even a mechanical winch if the rot went deep. He returned to the truck and unfolded a topographic map, marking the site in pencil. Beside it lay his tools. The Husqvarna chainsaw he kept tuned like a violin, spare chains wrapped in oiled cloth, fuel mixture in a red canister, safety harness, steel wedges, ropes coiled in neat loops. The gear was clean, well maintained. Years of habit made him check each item twice before a job. Precision was the only way he knew to impose order on the chaos of falling wood. That night, he ate alone at his kitchen table, the radio muttering distant static. Outside, wind rattled the siding. On the refrigerator door hung a faded photograph of his wife, Sarah, smiling under a summer tree. He caught himself staring at it too long, then looked away. The job had to be finished before the weekend. The city would send inspectors afterward. There was a payment bonus for early completion. He needed the money. He rinsed his plate, set it in the rack, and took a final look at the note from the municipal office pinned beside the phone. The words were clear: remove the oak completely, roots and all. No mention of legends, no room for hesitation. He rose before dawn. The world outside was coated with mist. He loaded his tools into the truck bed, the metal clinking softly, and drove out through the sleeping streets. As he approached the cemetery, headlights slid over the old gate and the worn stone angel perched beside it. The figure's face was streaked with black rain lines, its eyes hollow but watchful. Jonathan parked again by the fence, turned off the engine, and listened to the quiet. Somewhere a crow called once, then silence. He set up the safety cones and unloaded his gear. The fog drifted among the gravestones, curling around the inscriptions like smoke. He could smell damp earth, iron, something faintly sweet, the scent of decay mixed with sap. Kneeling, he inspected the base of the oak again. The roots pushed through the ground like the backs of buried animals. In some places, they had cracked the surrounding soil, lifting old headstones. He noted the lean of the trunk, 6 degrees east toward the road. He'd have to anchor a rope to the west to guide the fall. He fueled the chainsaw, pulled the starter cord, and listened to it catch. A clean growl, smooth and confident. The sound echoed across the cemetery, scattering the silence. He felt steadier now, enclosed in the familiar ritual of work. Yet, beneath the roar of the engine, he thought he heard another tone, faint and hollow, like something resonating deep inside the tree itself. He throttled down, listening. The engine sputtered to a stop, leaving only the sigh of wind and a slow creak from within the trunk. He crouched, studying the bark. The dark seam near the base looked deeper than before, the edges curling slightly outward as if something inside had shifted. He frowned, touched the edge of the fissure, and found it moist. Sap oozed sluggishly, dark as old resin. He rubbed it between his fingers, sticky with the faint scent of iron. Probably decay, he told himself, just rot and fungus feeding on centuries of wood. He wiped his hand on his pants and returned to the truck for a crowbar. He intended only to test the hollow spot, to see how deep the damage went. When he inserted the tip of the bar into the crack, a section of bark flaked away, revealing a smooth, hard surface beneath. For a moment, he thought it might be stone, embedded in the heartwood. He scraped gently, and the metal of the crowbar struck something that rang. A dull, unmistakable clink. He froze, listening again. The sound was not from the bar, but from within the tree itself, as if something metallic shifted slightly inside. He straightened, puzzled. Perhaps an old fence post or piece of hardware had been swallowed by the trunk decades ago. Trees often grew around nails, even tools, but this was deeper, larger. He tapped again. The same hollow clang replied, faint but real. The hair at the back of his neck lifted. A gust of wind passed through the branches above, and leaves tumbled down onto the graves like pieces of ash. He stepped back, uneasy. The fog had thinned, revealing the uneven line of tombstones extending behind him into the distance. He realized he was utterly alone. Not even a bird stirred now. Jonathan set down the crowbar carefully and turned off the saw. He would come back tomorrow with better light and proper cutting tools. Maybe it was nothing more than a buried pipe or forgotten marker trapped inside the trunk. Still, as he packed his equipment and glanced once more at the fissure, he couldn't shake the impression that the oak was more than dead wood, that it was listening, patient and heavy with secrets it had no reason to share. When he drove away, the rearview mirror caught a glimpse of the tree through the fog, a towering black shape, on its branches motionless despite the wind, standing guard over the uneven rows of graves. He told himself he would treat it like any other job. Mark the cut, make the notch, control the fall, haul the remains. Yet, as he left the cemetery road behind and the first drops of rain began to strike the windshield, he felt the uneasy conviction that he had already begun something he wouldn't easily walk away from. That night, long after he'd shut off the lights and lain down, Jonathan dreamed of wood groaning and splitting. He woke to the sound of the storm pressing against the windows. Somewhere in the dark, he thought he heard the distant echo of his chainsaw revving, though he knew it was impossible. When morning came, he would return to the oak and finish what he'd started. Whatever lay inside that trunk, metal, stone, or nothing at all, he would uncover it. Work was work. And yet, beneath that thought, another whispered through him like wind under a door. Sometimes what's buried stays buried for a reason. He turned over and watched the first gray light seep through the curtains. Outside, the rain was easing. The air smelled of wet soil and wood smoke. Tomorrow, the job would continue. And by tomorrow night, he told himself, the old oak by the graveyard would finally come down. The next morning arrived pale and cold, a veil of mist hanging low over the valley. Jonathan drove the familiar road again, the truck's tires hissing on the damp gravel. His hands rested on the steering wheel, knuckles stiff from the chill that had settled into his bones overnight. The air smelled of rain and rust, and the light that filtered through the clouds had the flat gray tone of an old photograph. Ahead, the cemetery fence appeared through the fog like a rib cage rising from the ground. Beyond it, the oak waited, massive and still, as though it had not moved in 100 years and never intended to. He parked by the gate and stepped out. The silence was different now, heavier, thicker, filled with the faint hum of insects and the whisper of distant wind through bare branches. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean but drained of color. He walked the length of the fence, noting the way water had pooled in hollows between the graves. The ground was uneven, each step a soft thud into mud that clung to his boots. Moss glowed faintly green on the stones, and long threads of ivy crawled across names that were no longer legible. It was a place where memory didn't fade so much as sink slowly beneath the weight of years. As he approached the oak, he saw the woman for the first time. She was kneeling by one of the older graves near the far side of the plot, her gray shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. A metal bucket stood beside her, half full of soapy water, and she was scrubbing the lichen from a stone marker with careful, deliberate strokes. When she noticed him, she straightened slowly and wiped her hands on a rag. Her face was deeply lined, the kind of face carved by long seasons of work outdoors. She looked at him without surprise, as though she had known he would come. "You're the man they sent for the tree," she said after a moment, her voice low but firm. Jonathan nodded. She studied him for a few seconds longer, then turned her gaze toward the oak. "They always send someone new every few years. I wondered when it would be next." He said nothing. She took a breath that came out like a sigh. "That tree's not just wood, you know. It grew out of a grave. They say the coffin broke apart beneath it long ago, and the roots wrapped themselves around the bones. It's been feeding on the dead ever since." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not with superstition, but with something closer to warning. "You cut it, you'll open what was buried." Jonathan looked at the tree again. The fog drifted around its trunk, softening the edges. He didn't believe her words, not exactly, but they found a place to settle somewhere deep inside, in that quiet part of him that understood how time turned truth into legend. "I'm just here to keep it from falling," he said finally. The woman nodded once without argument and went back to her work. He walked past her and made his way deeper into the cemetery. The ground sloped gently upward, leading to a section marked by older stones, their surfaces pitted and tilted, the inscriptions eroded to shadows. He crouched beside one and brushed away a layer of wet leaves. The letters beneath were faint but readable. Henry Mason, 1872, 1912. Something in him stilled. The name tugged at a memory, though he couldn't place it. He traced the worn grooves of the inscription, the faint remnants of an epitaph eaten away by time. When he straightened, the air felt colder, and the mist had begun to close in again. He walked the perimeter slowly, marking boundaries in his mind. The oak stood near the fence where the newer section met the old. Its roots had broken through the soil and intertwined with the iron railing, pushing against the concrete base. Several nearby gravestones were cracked or tilted, their foundations disturbed. He measured the angle of the trunk with his eye. 7 degrees of lean now, not 6. The decay was spreading faster than he'd expected. Another storm might bring it down whether he cut it or not. He returned to the truck to retrieve his tools, but hesitated, glancing again at the woman. She had finished scrubbing and was now lighting a candle in front of one of the headstones. The small flame flickered weakly in the damp air. He found himself walking toward her. "You take care of this place?" he asked. She nodded. "Since I was a girl," she said, "my mother before me, and her father before that. Somebody has to remember." She gestured toward the oak. There was a time when that tree marked a grave. The man they buried there had no name on his coffin. Only the undertaker and the night knew who he was. Folks said the watchman wrote it down, but the book disappeared when he did. They searched for him for months, but he was gone without a trace. Some say he left. Others say he was buried, same as the rest, only deeper. The words sank into Jonathan like slow rain into dry soil. He wanted to ask more, but she had already turned back to her candle, murmuring something under her breath, a prayer maybe, or simply the rhythm of habit. He stepped away, the sound of his boots muffled by the wet earth. Later that afternoon, the clouds thickened again, the air heavy with the promise of more rain. Jonathan spent hours studying the tree, testing the firmness of the soil around it, the resistance of the bark, the pattern of the branches overhead. He found traces of lightning along one side, a pale streak where the bark had once burned and healed. Near the base, the crack he'd noticed yesterday seemed deeper, its edges slightly gaping, revealing dark, spongy wood within. He pressed his hand against it, and for a moment he thought he felt a faint vibration, as if the hollow inside were resonating with the pulse of the ground. He drew back sharply. The rational part of him said it was the wind moving through cavities in the trunk, or maybe the echo of his own heartbeat in his palm. But the sound that came from inside was not wind. It was deeper, slower, the kind of murmur that trees sometimes make when they settle under their own weight. He stepped back and looked around. The woman was gone, her bucket overturned by the fence. Only the candle still burned faintly in the distance. As evening settled, the cemetery grew darker. The fog thinned but did not lift. The air was cold enough now that his breath hung before him. He gathered his things and loaded them into the truck, but before leaving he took one last look at the oak. In the half-light it seemed to absorb the dimness around it rather than reflect it, as though it were built not of wood but of shadow hardened by time. Driving home, he found himself replaying the woman's words, the name he'd read on the gravestone, Henry Mason, and the stories of the missing watchman. He stopped at the diner for coffee, hoping the noise and the smell of fried food might ground him. A few men sat at the counter, their caps pulled low, their voices quiet. When Jonathan mentioned the cemetery, conversation stopped again. The cook, a heavy-set man with a scar on his jaw, finally said, "You don't want that job, friend. My granddad told me about that tree. Said they planted it after some trouble in 1912. There was a man who worked the grounds back then, kept records of burials. He went missing. They said he knew too much about things that weren't supposed to be written down." Jonathan sipped his coffee in silence. He wanted facts, not legends, but the lines between them were blurred here. He asked if anyone knew where those old records might be kept. The cook shrugged. "Probably in the county archive, but they say parts of it burned back in the 50s. Half the cemetery maps went with it." When he left the diner, the air outside felt even colder. The lights from the town faded behind him as he drove toward his house at the edge of the woods. Inside, he built a small fire and spread his notes on the table. He sketched the outline of the cemetery, the slope of the land, the location of the oak. In the margin, almost without realizing it, he wrote, "Henry Mason, 1872, 1912. Watchman?" The question mark hovered on the page like a whisper he couldn't shake. Sleep came slowly that night. The wind rattled the windows, and the flames in the stove flickered shadows along the walls. He dreamed of roots crawling through soil like hands searching for something lost. When he woke before dawn, the house was silent except for the ticking of the cooling stove. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. Outside, the world was still wrapped in gray, but the rain had stopped. He knew what he had to do. If the ground itself was hiding something, it would show its truth in time. But he would not be careless. He would learn what he could before cutting. Somewhere, he thought, there might still be a record, a name, a date, a reason that tree had been left standing all these years. He dressed, packed his tools again, and slipped the folded map into his coat pocket. As he stepped outside, the air was sharp with frost, and a thin band of light had begun to rise over the hills. Behind it, the sky glowed faintly gold. He paused, staring at that line of light, and for the first time in a long while felt the faint edge of anticipation. A sense that the day ahead would reveal something that had waited far too long to be seen. By the time he reached the cemetery again, the mist had almost burned away. The oak stood unchanged, its branches black against the pale sky, its roots gripping the earth like a fist. Jonathan walked toward it slowly, the morning quiet pressing close around him. He could still smell the faint trace of candle wax where the woman had prayed the day before. Near the base of the tree, a single leaf moved despite the windless air, turning over once before settling against the damp soil. He watched it a moment, then bent to inspect the trunk again. The crack had widened overnight. He could see deeper now, where the wood turned from brown to black and finally to something metallic. For a long moment, he stared, feeling the slow, cold thud of his heart. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his work gloves, and began to clear the debris around the roots. Somewhere beneath that ancient bark, beneath decades of rot and silence, something waited. And as the first sound of his shovel bit into the soil, the morning seemed to hold its breath. The third morning dawned without wind, a thin frost tracing silver veins across the windows of Jonathan's truck as he drove toward the cemetery. The engine's hum was the only sound on the deserted road. He felt heavier than usual, as though the air itself pressed down on him. The previous day's discoveries, the name on the headstone, the woman's story, the faint metallic sound from within the oak, had left a residue of unease that clung to him through the night. He had lain awake for hours, imagining the dark hollow inside the trunk, the strange vibration under his palm, the echo of metal. Now, as the gates came into view, the feeling only deepened. The cemetery was still drenched in the pale half-light of early morning. The fog had lifted, but the ground gleamed with dew, and a thin mist hovered above the graves. The oak rose from the slope like a survivor of another world, its crown stark against the washed-out sky. The ground beneath it was churned and soft from his previous digging, the fissure at the base wider than before. Jonathan parked near the fence and sat for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the faint steam rise from the grass. Then he took a deep breath, reached for his gloves, and stepped out. The air was sharper than he expected, biting at his face. As he walked toward the oak, his boots left deep impressions in the damp earth. The woman who had tended the graves was nowhere to be seen today. The only sound was the slow drip of water from the branches above. He paused beside the tree and studied it carefully. The crack he had examined the day before now revealed something dark beneath its inner bark, a shadow that caught light differently, dull but unmistakably metallic. It wasn't just a nail or a piece of fence iron. It was larger, smoother, and set deep within the wood. He fetched his tools from the truck, crowbar, chisel, small axe, flashlight, and returned to the base of the trunk. The frost on the ground melted as he worked, leaving cold mud clinging to his boots. He pressed the edge of the crowbar into the fissure and levered gently. The bark came away in heavy flakes, releasing a smell of damp rot mixed with something sharp and mineral. As the fragments fell, a shape began to emerge, a flat surface buried deep within the living wood. He cleared away more bark until he could see its outline, a square corner, an edge slightly rounded with time. The metal was dark with rust, its texture rough but clearly forged. He tapped it with the chisel, and the sound that answered was hollow, like the ring of an old tin roof. For a while, he simply stared at it, the weight of what he was seeing sinking in slowly. It was too symmetrical to be part of any root or tool swallowed by accident. The tree had grown around it deliberately, as if it had been placed there and forgotten. He worked more carefully now, chiseling away layers of decayed wood until the full edge of the object showed, a box of iron or steel, roughly the size of a small suitcase. The bark had molded itself around the corners, sealing it as the trunk thickened over decades. The front face was pitted with corrosion, but he could just make out the faint outline of a clasp or lock. Jonathan sat back on his heels, breathing hard. The damp had soaked through his jeans, and the smell of wet wood filled his lungs. He glanced over his shoulder at the rows of graves behind him, as though expecting someone to be watching, but there was no one. The cemetery was utterly silent except for the rustle of a few birds shifting high in the branches. He wiped his hands on his gloves and took a sip from his thermos, though the coffee had already gone cold. Then, kneeling again, he wedged the crowbar beneath the upper edge of the box and pried gently. The metal groaned but did not give. The oak's grip was tight, the fibers of its heartwood fused around the intruder. He paused, thinking through his options. Cutting deeper could destabilize the trunk and cause it to split unpredictably. Yet, if he left the box buried, the rot would continue to spread, and the job could not be finished properly. He decided to widen the opening just enough to loosen the object without compromising the tree's base. He started the chainsaw and guided the blade carefully along the edges, letting the teeth bite slowly into the softened wood. Each cut sent a rain of sawdust down his arms and over the roots. The saw's steady growl filled the air, drowning out every other sound, until suddenly the chain struck something hard with a shower of sparks. He killed the engine instantly. The echo of the strike lingered like the toll of a bell. He crouched, peering into the cut. The blade had nicked the corner of the metal box, leaving a bright scar through the rust. He reached in with his fingers and felt the cold edge beneath the splinters of wood. The box was embedded tight but movable now, the bond of the trunk weakened by age. He braced his knees against the roots and pulled. The first attempt barely shifted it. The second brought a creaking protest from within the wood, followed by a dull cracking sound. He adjusted his grip, leaned back, and pulled again with all his weight. With a sudden, reluctant snap, the box came free, tearing a chunk of the tree's inner core with it. He fell backward into the wet grass, the heavy object landing beside him with a thud that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. For a moment, he just lay there, breathing hard, staring at the thing he had dragged from the tree. It was rectangular, no larger than a toolbox, its sides corroded and streaked with dark stains. A small brass padlock hung from the front clasp, its surface almost black with oxidation. He could see faint engravings along the rim, but the metal was too worn to read clearly. The weight of the box was surprising. It felt dense, filled with something that shifted faintly when he tilted it. He tapped it with the crowbar, and the hollow sound returned, deeper this time, resonant, as though whatever was inside was packed close and solid. Jonathan sat up and looked at the scar he'd left in the tree. The hollow gaped like an open wound, exposing pale wood within, streaked with black lines of decay. Sap oozed slowly from the torn fibers, glistening in the weak sunlight. It looked almost like blood. He pressed the edge of the bark closed as best he could, though the damage was already done. The rot was too far gone. Even if he left the tree standing, it wouldn't survive another season. He carried the box to the truck and set it carefully in the bed. For a long moment, he stood there, unsure whether to open it. His rational mind told him it was just an old tool chest, maybe something left behind by a worker decades ago. But the placement, the way it had been entombed inside the tree, suggested something deliberate. It wasn't buried in the ground where it might be found. It had been hidden within living wood, sealed by time itself. He decided not to break the lock immediately. Instead, he wrapped the box in a tarp and secured it with rope. The job was already strange enough. He would examine it later under better light when his thoughts were clearer. Still, as he drove away from the cemetery, he couldn't stop glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting the tarp to stir. At home, he laid the box on his workbench. The garage was dim, lit only by a single bulb that flickered faintly. Tools hung in neat rows along the wall, the air thick with the scent of oil and sawdust. He turned the box over slowly, inspecting every seam. The bottom was lined with a thin layer of hardened resin, as though it had been coated intentionally to waterproof it. The brass lock was brittle with age, but the mechanism looked simple. He considered cutting it, then hesitated. He felt a strange reluctance to rush this moment. The box had waited decades. It could wait another few hours. He went inside, washed the mud from his hands, and brewed fresh coffee. The sun was setting by the time he returned. The last of the light slanted through the dusty windows, painting the workbench in amber hues. He set the cup down beside the box and picked up a small screwdriver. With careful precision, he slipped the tip into the keyhole and began to feel for the pins. The metal resisted at first, then gave with a faint click. The lock sprang open, and the clasp lifted easily under his thumb. The lid stuck briefly before yielding with a soft crack. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper and rust, a scent so old it felt like history itself. The contents were arranged neatly, as though someone had taken care to preserve them. A small leather satchel, a few tools, an iron mallet, a folding knife, a rusted key, and a narrow glass lantern with its wick still intact. Beneath these lay a stack of yellowed papers bound with a thin strip of cloth. Jonathan lifted them gently, his fingers leaving pale prints in the dust. The top sheet was a ledger, the ink faded but legible. Across the first line, written in a hand both careful and tired, was a name: Henry Mason. He stared at it for a long time, the connection slotting into place like a puzzle piece. The gravestone he had seen, the woman's story of the missing watchman. It was all here. This was his box. He turned another page and found notes written in tight, deliberate script, dates, names, brief entries describing burials. Many of them were ordinary, recording the details of those interred within the cemetery, but every few pages an entry appeared that broke the pattern. No name, night burial, paid in cash. Each of these was marked with a faint cross beside the date. Jonathan felt a prickle along his spine. There were at least a dozen such entries spanning several months in 1912. The last one was dated October 27th, the same year carved on Mason's gravestone. Beneath it, a final line written in darker ink. They told me to stay silent. Tomorrow night, another without name. If I do not return, this record will tell why. He set the papers down and sat back, the chair creaking beneath him. The garage felt smaller now, the air heavier. He looked again at the box and imagined the man who had sealed it, perhaps in haste, perhaps in fear, before it was hidden in the hollow of the oak. The tools and the lamp, the ledger, all of it suggested preparation, not panic. Mason had intended this to be found someday when the time was right. Outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the loose pane in the window. Jonathan stood and turned off the light, leaving the box in shadow. As he walked back to the house, the night air felt colder, carrying the scent of rain. He locked the door behind him, but found little comfort in the act. In the distance, he thought he heard the faint creak of branches swaying, though the sky was still. He told himself it was only the wind moving through the trees beyond the property, yet the sound persisted, slow and rhythmic, like wood straining under an unseen weight. He lay awake long after midnight, the images replaying in his mind. The rusted box, the ledger, the name repeated over and over. When he finally slept, his dreams were filled with the sound of a hammer striking metal and the echo of footsteps pacing between gravestones under the cover of darkness. And somewhere beneath it all, faint but constant, was the heartbeat of the oak itself, pulsing with the memory of what it had been made to keep. The dawn broke slowly through a wall of fog, thick and heavy as smoke, dulling the light to a dim pewter. Jonathan had slept little, his thoughts circling endlessly around the rusted box now sitting on his workbench. The name inside it, Henry Mason, had rooted itself in his mind, persistent and uneasy. He could still smell the damp paper, the metallic tang of the old ink, the faint scent of iron that had clung to his hands long after he'd shut the lid. It had been a century since the man had disappeared, and yet somehow the past felt closer than the present. When he returned to the garage, the air inside was cold enough to see his breath. The box remained where he had left it, haloed in the weak light from the single window. Dust floated in the beams like motes of ash. He lifted the lid once more and studied the contents under his flashlight. The leather satchel was stiff, the tools inside rusted beyond use. The glass lantern, though clouded, still held the faint smell of old oil. He found himself staring again at the journal, its brittle pages tied neatly with string. It wasn't curiosity that made him untie it, it was obligation. Something about the care with which the watchman had sealed these things away demanded that someone, someday, understand. He turned the first page slowly. The handwriting was small and precise, each letter carefully formed, as though Mason had written for an audience of one. The earliest entries were mundane, notes about maintenance, tools, daily tasks. He wrote of trimming hedges, cleaning moss from gravestones, keeping records of new burials. There were observations of weather and work, of the way frost formed on the iron gates, of the smell of lilac in the spring. For pages at a time, it read like a life measured in repetitions, but gradually, a tone of unease began to creep between the lines. One entry caught his attention. Mason had written of a night burial carried out without ceremony. A cart had arrived long after sunset, its wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. 2 men had come with it, strangers, not locals, and carried a long, narrow box. Mason described their silence, their refusal to meet his eyes. He noted that the grave was dug in a corner of the grounds near the outer fence, and that the coffin was unmarked. "They paid me to record it nowhere," the entry said, "but a record must exist, or else the ground will not rest." Jonathan flipped further. Each week, Mason noted another burial like it. Sometimes 2. Always at night, always without names. He began to refer to them simply as the silent ones. His writing grew denser. The ink pressed harder into the paper. He described feeling watched while making his rounds, shadows moving where no living person should be. At first, he thought it was the play of lantern light on the trees, but soon he became convinced it was something else, someone keeping guard over what had been buried. By the end of the summer of 1912, the entries changed again. The tone shifted from duty to fear. "They come after dark," Mason wrote. "They say it's for the war, but the war is far away. These are not soldiers they bring. The last one was smaller than a man, smaller even than a boy. I think he was only half alive." The words that followed were smudged, as though he had tried to blot them out. The next page began abruptly with a confession. "I should have refused, but they said if I spoke, the ground would swallow me as it did them. Jonathan sat back, his heart beating unevenly. He could almost see the watchman hunched over his desk in the candlelight, the quill scratching across the paper, while something outside creaked in the dark. The image was too vivid, too human. He turned to the final entries, feeling the pages thin beneath his fingers. October 27, 1912. They told me this will be the last. I'm to meet them near the fence by the old oak. They say the coffin will be light. I'm to prepare the hole myself and ask no questions. But tonight, I will write what I see. If they silence me, let this speak. That was the final line. The page after it was blank, save for a dark stain in the corner where the ink had run, as if spilled in haste. Jonathan closed the book and stared at the wall. The date matched the last entry in the burial records he'd found in the box. Everything after that was silence. No more notes, no mention of the watchman again. The man had vanished, and the cemetery had buried his absence beneath routine. He poured himself another cup of coffee, though it had long gone cold. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted it. Outside, a thin wind moved through the trees, rattling the branches against the eaves. The sound reminded him of the hollow creak inside the oak when he had cut into it. For the first time, he considered the possibility that what he'd found was not just a forgotten artifact, but evidence of something deliberate, something meant to be hidden forever. That afternoon, unable to sit still, he drove to the county records office. The building was old and smelled of dust and old paper, its narrow windows clouded with grime. Behind the counter sat a clerk with thick glasses and a patient expression. Jonathan asked about the cemetery archives, explaining he was researching property records for his work. The man nodded and led him to a back room filled with wooden cabinets. The drawers were labeled by decade. Many bore signs of water damage, some were locked, others half rotted. He found the ledger for 1910 through 1915 and turned the pages carefully. Most of the entries were routine: names, dates, lot numbers. But between August and November 1912 there were several blank lines, entire pages left unwritten. The handwriting resumed abruptly afterward, as though nothing unusual had happened. When he asked about missing records, the clerk shrugged. There was a fire sometime in the 50s, he said. Burned up a lot of files from the older cemeteries. Gaps all over. Sometimes they just didn't bother filling them back in. Jonathan thanked him and left, but his mind wouldn't let go of the coincidence. Blank pages in the official books, secret burials in the journal, and a box sealed inside the oak. The connections formed themselves whether he wanted them to or not. As he drove back toward the outskirts of town, the road wound past fields of dry grass bending under the wind. The sky had turned the color of pewter again, clouds hanging low and heavy. When he reached his house, he found the evening settling early. He lit the lamp in the garage and reopened the box, spreading the contents carefully on the table. The tools were ordinary but old-fashioned, their wooden handles worn smooth. Among them he found a brass tag, tarnished but still readable. It bore the inscription, "Property of H. Mason, Sexton's Office." On the back, scratched faintly with a knife, was another set of letters, D27 10 12. The same date again. He stared at it for a long time. The repetition of that day felt deliberate, almost ritual. Something had ended there, not just a life, but a secret being sealed away. He placed the tag beside the ledger and looked at the dark window, where his reflection stared back at him. Behind the reflection, the trees of his yard swayed in the wind. As night deepened, Jonathan began to transcribe parts of the journal, page by page. He copied the entries into a notebook, the act grounding him in something methodical and real. Yet, as he wrote, he noticed how the words began to affect him. Mason's sentences had a rhythm that pulled him inward. The watchman had been meticulous, but beneath the surface a kind of desperation pulsed. "The ground remembers," Mason had written in one entry, "even when men forget. It keeps what we cannot face." Jonathan paused, his pen hovering above the paper. He couldn't shake the thought that the oak itself had been a part of that memory, a living archive that swallowed guilt and silence alike. Around midnight, he shut the notebook and stood. The air in the garage felt close, almost suffocating. He stepped outside for fresh air. The night was moonless, the landscape washed in shades of gray. He could hear the faint sound of wind moving through the distant trees, a slow, rhythmic moan that seemed to follow him as he walked to the edge of his yard. The fields beyond glimmered with frost, and in the far distance he could see the faint rise of the cemetery hill. Even from here, he thought he could make out the silhouette of the oak, a darker shape against the horizon. He stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. The story he'd uncovered wasn't finished. The watchman's disappearance, the missing records, the strange object inside the tree, all of it pointed toward one unanswered question. What had happened on that final night in October 1912? The only way to find out, he knew, was to return to the oak. Whatever Mason had seen before he vanished, whatever secret he had hidden within the wood, it was still waiting there, buried in the heart of that dying tree. Jonathan turned back toward the house, his breath white in the air. Tomorrow he would go back. He would finish the job he'd started, though it no longer felt like a job at all. The city's order to fell the oak had become irrelevant. What mattered now was understanding why it had stood for so long, untouched, guarding what the world had chosen to forget. As he closed the door behind him and shut off the lights, the darkness of the house felt alive, filled with the faint scent of earth and decay. And somewhere in that silence, he thought he heard again the echo of a page turning in the dark. Morning came with a thin veil of ice over the puddles in Jonathan's yard. The frost shone pale blue under the early sun, and his breath rose in clouds as he loaded his tools into the truck bed. Sleep had not come easily. The night had been full of half-waking thoughts, of pages rustling though the windows were closed, of a faint rhythmic sound that might have been a branch scraping the roof, or something knocking from deep underground. When he finally rose, the light outside carried the gray stillness of winter. He knew before he turned the key in the ignition that this would be the day everything buried in that cemetery, everything sealed in wood and soil, would be forced to the surface again. The road to the graveyard wound between bare trees that rattled faintly in the wind. Jonathan drove with the window cracked, letting the cold air keep him alert. The journal of Henry Mason lay on the passenger seat beside him, bound in twine, its corners still flaking dust. He had reread the last entries before leaving, the words etched in his mind like the grooves in a coffin lid. If they silence me, let this speak. The phrase had settled into him overnight. Now it pressed behind his ribs like a weight. When he reached the cemetery, the sky was the color of wet ash. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance, then was silent. The ground was firmer after the frost, the mud frozen into uneven ridges. He parked near the fence and stepped out. The air was utterly still. Even the oak seemed to have stopped breathing, its branches frozen in a dark tangle overhead. He stood there for a moment, listening. Beneath the silence, he thought he could hear the faint creak of roots shifting in the soil. Then, gathering his gear, he walked toward the tree. The hollow he had torn open 2 days before gaped wider now, the bark around it curled like burned paper. The exposed wood had turned darker overnight, the sap seeping from the wound thick and red-brown. He touched it briefly. It was sticky and cold, with a faint metallic smell. The rot was spreading from within, softening the heartwood. The trunk's interior no longer looked solid. It seemed almost porous, like bone. He set down his bag and started the saw. The machine's growl shattered the morning stillness. The blade bit into the wood with a steady hum, and he guided it carefully through the decayed section. The air filled with the smell of resin and mold. The sawdust that sprayed from the cut was dark, nearly black. He adjusted the angle, widening the opening, wanting to reach the hollow where he had found the metal box. He worked slowly, the vibrations running up his arms. Every few minutes he stopped to check the progress, wiping the sweat from his brow even though the air was cold. After an hour, he shut off the saw and examined the interior. The cavity was larger than he'd imagined, stretching upward into the trunk's core. He shone his flashlight inside. The beam revealed layers of rough wood and twisted fibers, all slick with sap. Something glimmered faintly near the center, a pale curve against the darkness. He leaned closer, narrowing the beam. For a moment, he thought it was another fragment of the box, but as he reached in with his gloved hand, his fingers brushed against something smooth, rigid, and unmistakably organic. He froze, then pulled back quickly. The object dislodged and rolled forward through the sawdust, landing in the dirt beside his boot. It was white, long, and curved slightly, a fragment of bone bleached by time. He stared at it for several seconds, unable to move. It was too large to belong to an animal, too finely shaped to be anything but human. The reality of it hit him with a dull, physical force. This was no forgotten artifact. Someone, maybe Mason himself, had been entombed within the living wood. Jonathan felt the air drain from his lungs. For a moment, he simply stood there, the chainsaw silent at his side, listening to the distant hum of blood in his ears. The rational part of his mind took over first. He needed to stop, mark the area, call someone. His body moved almost automatically as he reached for his phone, but when he looked down at the bone again, something in him hesitated. It wasn't just lying loose, it was fused with the wood, as though the tree had grown around it, swallowing it slowly, decade after decade, until it became part of its structure. He could see thin tendrils of hardened resin binding to the porous surface like veins. He took a few photographs with trembling hands, then stepped back. The frost cracked beneath his boots. He knew he couldn't continue cutting. Whatever this was, it had crossed the line between work and something far deeper. He called the county office, explaining briefly that human remains had been found during contracted removal. His voice sounded oddly calm in his ears, detached. They promised to send officers and an investigator. He hung up and waited. The minutes stretched into hours. The air grew colder as the sun struggled behind thickening clouds. Jonathan kept his distance from the tree but couldn't take his eyes off it. The hollow seemed to widen even as he watched, the weight of the trunk shifting subtly with each passing gust. At one point, a piece of bark fell away, revealing more of the pale interior. It looked disturbingly like ribs. When the police arrived, their cars moved quietly along the gravel road. 2 officers and a forensic team stepped out, their breath fogging in the air. The lead investigator, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a clipped tone, introduced herself only briefly before directing her team toward the tree. Jonathan explained what he had done, how he'd been contracted to remove the oak, how he'd found the metal box first, then the bone. His voice faltered when he mentioned Henry Mason's name. The investigator took notes, but said nothing. They set up yellow tape around the site, marking the perimeter. The forensic team began carefully removing soil and bark from around the opening, using brushes and small tools. Jonathan watched as they worked, their movements precise and deliberate. Before long, more bone fragments emerged from the wood. First, a section of vertebrae, then what looked like part of a skull, the bone so thin and fragile it crumbled at a touch. The tree had preserved it in its own way, encasing it in layers of resin and fiber. The investigator crouched beside the opening and shone her light inside. "There's more," she said quietly. "Much more." Her team continued to clear the space, uncovering what remained of a wooden plank pressed against the inner wall of the trunk. It was darkened with age, but nails still glinted faintly along one edge. It had once been a coffin lid, now collapsed inward and fused with the growing wood. Jonathan stood a few paces back, the sight pressing on him with the weight of inevitability. The oak had not merely grown above a grave, it had consumed one. It had taken the coffin, the bones, the objects buried with them, and sealed them inside its own body. Decades of growth had hidden the truth so completely that the world had simply forgotten. By afternoon, the forensic team had removed several small items from the cavity: a rusted ring, a corroded military medal, and a bundle of fabric that disintegrated when touched. Each was bagged carefully, labeled, and carried to one of the waiting cars. The investigator turned to Jonathan. "We'll take the remains for analysis," she said. "From what I can tell, they've been here a long time. Half a century, maybe more. We'll need to confirm." He nodded mutely. The sound of zippers closing plastic evidence bags made him shiver. The team photographed the hollow, then began sealing it with tarps to protect it overnight. As they worked, Jonathan noticed something else: faint scratches carved into the inner wall of the trunk, just above where the coffin had been wedged. He pointed them out. The investigator leaned closer, tracing the marks with her gloved finger. "Initials," she murmured. The grooves formed 2 letters, worn but legible. "H.M." Jonathan swallowed hard. "Henry Mason," he said quietly. The woman glanced up at him, expression unreadable. "You said that name before," she replied. "How do you know it?" He explained about the box, the journal, the entries describing the last burial. As he spoke, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the graves. When he finished, she looked at the hollow again, then back at him. "You may be right," she said. "If those are his initials, he might have been the one buried here. We'll know once we get the results." The team packed up as the light began to fade. They promised to contact him once the analysis was complete. Then they left, leaving only the yellow tape fluttering in the breeze and the faint smell of soil and sap. Jonathan stood alone beside the tree, the hollow now draped in plastic sheeting that rustled softly in the wind. He felt neither fear nor relief, only a numb exhaustion, as if the earth itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. He turned towards the graves nearby and noticed the woman's candle from earlier days, now just a stub of wax on the edge of a stone. He lit it again with a match from his pocket, shielding the flame from the wind. For a brief moment, it flickered bright and steady, casting a thin glow across the grass. The light caught the edge of the oak, illuminating the rough surface where the bark had split. The sap there gleamed wetly, as though the tree itself were bleeding. By the time he returned home, the first snow had begun to fall. The flakes melted on his windshield, leaving streaks that caught the glare of the headlights. He parked in the driveway and sat for a long while without turning off the engine. The journal lay on the seat beside him, the twine loosened now from being handled too often. He ran his fingers over the worn cover. Inside, he knew the story had already told him how it would end. Mason had written that he was to meet the men by the oak on October 27th, and he had never been seen again. The bones inside the trunk, the initials carved in the wood, they were not evidence of coincidence. They were proof of fulfillment. That night, Jonathan dreamed of roots winding through soil, wrapping around wooden planks and bones, tightening until wood and flesh became one. He dreamed of the watchman standing by the tree, lantern in hand, his face pale beneath the flickering light, and of voices whispering from beneath the ground. When he woke, the house was silent except for the ticking of the clock. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the earth in a soft white blanket. For the first time in days, he felt a strange calm. The truth had begun to surface, piece by piece. Yet deep down, he understood that the tree's secret was only partly revealed. The dead had been found, but the living silence that had kept them hidden still lingered in the air, waiting for the rest of the story to be unearthed. The snow that began the night before had stopped by dawn, leaving the world coated in white silence. The air outside was motionless, the kind of deep stillness that seems to erase the sounds of living things. Jonathan stood by his window, a mug of untouched coffee cooling in his hand, watching the flakes drift lazily from the roof. The frost blurred the shapes of the trees beyond the yard, and for a moment he couldn't tell where the world ended and the sky began. The events of the previous day felt unreal. The discovery, the police, the bones lifted from the hollow like artifacts of another life. Yet they had happened. The scar in the oak, the initials, the remains sealed inside it for a century. None of it could be imagined away. The phone rang just after 8. The sound startled him. It seemed out of place in the hush. He picked it up, expecting a routine call, but it was the investigator. Her voice was steady but subdued. The forensic team had completed a preliminary analysis of the remains. The bones belonged to an adult male, estimated age between 40 and 50, and had been inside the tree for roughly 100 years, give or take a decade. There were no signs of trauma on the surviving bones, no fractures, no weapon marks. But there was evidence that the man had not been buried in the usual way. The position of the bones, the arrangement of the wood fibers, suggested the body had been placed in a shallow cavity within the living tree before it healed over. The conclusion was simple, if unnerving. The man had not died elsewhere and been buried under the tree. The tree had grown around him. Jonathan thanked her quietly. When he hung up, his hand trembled slightly. He looked around his house, the worn furniture, the half-drawn curtains, the thin film of sawdust on the table where he had left the journal open. The story had finally come full circle. The man in the journal, the watchman who had written of the secret burials and the men who came in the night, Henry Mason, had been found at last. Later that morning, he drove into town. The snow on the road had turned to slush, the tires hissing through it. He parked by the old records office, the same building he had visited days earlier, and went inside. The clerk recognized him and gestured toward the reading room. Jonathan asked to see any files relating to the cemetery's maintenance in the early 20th century. The clerk returned with a folder so thin it seemed barely worth opening. But tucked among the yellowed pages was a single report dated November 1912. It was brief. 2 paragraphs describing the disappearance of the cemetery sexton, Henry Mason, who had failed to appear for work 3 days in a row. The note said that his residence had been found empty and locked from the inside. No signs of struggle, no personal belongings missing. The file closed with a line in neat official script, presumed to have absconded without notice. Jonathan closed the folder and sat in silence for a long time. The words felt obscene now, as though the system had conspired to erase a man rather than find him. He imagined Mason that final night, standing by the oak, waiting for the men who had ordered him to keep silent. Maybe he had confronted them. Maybe he had refused to bury another nameless body. Maybe the last thing he saw was the hollow in the tree opening like a mouth. When he left the building, the streets were bright under the midday sun. The snow was melting, running in small rivers along the gutters. He drove toward the cemetery without really deciding to. The truck followed the same familiar path past the mill, the empty diner, the fields turning back to mud. The gate of the cemetery stood open, the yellow police tape still fluttering in the breeze. The oak was visible from the road even now, a dark monument against the washed-out sky. He parked outside the gate and walked in slowly. The air smelled of thawing earth. The tarp that covered the hollow had sagged under the weight of the snow, and droplets of water slid down its surface, darkening the wood beneath. He lifted the edge carefully and peered inside. The cavity looked emptier now that the remains had been removed, but the shape of the coffin was still visible, a shadow preserved in the fibers. He could see where the initials had been carved, the grooves sharp and deliberate. H.M. The letters seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as though the tree had absorbed not just the man's body, but his presence. He stood there for a long time, the wind biting at his neck. Around him, the graves stretched out in neat rows, each one marked by a name and date, all except the place where the oak stood. There was no marker, no stone, only the scarred trunk and the frozen ground. The thought came to him that perhaps the town had always known something was wrong here, even if they couldn't explain it. The legends, the warnings, the stories of the cursed tree, they had been their way of keeping distance from what lay beneath. When he returned to his truck, he found the old woman from before standing near the gate, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She looked smaller now, fragile against the pale light. He greeted her quietly, and she nodded without speaking. Her eyes drifted toward the oak. "They found him, didn't they?" she said after a pause. Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said, "I think they did." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "My grandmother used to say the ground remembers even when people don't. She said every lie we bury has to come up sooner or later. Maybe that's what he was, something the town couldn't keep down anymore." Jonathan wanted to ask her what she meant, but she was already walking away, her boots crunching softly through the snow. He watched her until she disappeared behind the line of graves. That evening, the investigator called again. The lab had finished analyzing the items found with the body. The ring had been gold, engraved with the initials H.M., confirmation beyond doubt. The medal was from the Spanish-American War, awarded posthumously to a private named Samuel Griggs. The letters found in the remains of the coffin were too damaged to read, but one fragment bore the words, "Forgive us." The investigator's tone softened. "Whoever put him there," she said, "didn't just hide him. They made sure the world forgot him completely. No report, no grave, no record. The tree became his tomb." Jonathan thanked her again, his voice barely audible. After the call ended, he sat in the dark for a long time. The lamp in the corner flickered, throwing slow shadows across the walls. He felt the weight of the discovery pressing down on him, not just the tragedy of one man's death, but the way the world had conspired to turn it into silence. Mason had tried to preserve truth in his journal, to leave a trace, but even that had been swallowed by the oak until chance, or fate, brought Jonathan's saw to it a century later. In the days that followed, the town began to talk. A local paper ran a small article about the discovery of historical remains, though it avoided details. Some called the tree cursed again, others called it sacred. The city council debated whether to cut it down completely or preserve it as a memorial. Jonathan attended the meeting only once, sitting quietly in the back as officials argued over budgets and liability. None of them mentioned Mason by name. To them, the matter was paperwork, a box to be checked before they could move on. He left before the vote. The next morning, he went back to the cemetery one last time. The air was warmer now, and the snow had begun to recede, revealing the muddy grass beneath. He carried Mason's journal with him, its pages sealed in a clear plastic sleeve to protect them from the damp. The police had returned it after making copies for their records. He approached the oak and placed the journal gently inside the hollow, resting it where the coffin had been. The smell of the wood was rich and earthy. For a long time he stood there with his hand on the bark, feeling its roughness under his palm. He thought of Mason, riding by lantern light, his careful handwriting filling the pages with truths no one wanted to hear. He thought of the men who had buried him, believing the earth would keep their secret. And he thought of the tree, standing year after year, growing thicker and darker until its silence became the town's memory. When he stepped back, he noticed something he hadn't before. A small sprout growing from one of the roots, a thin green shoot pushing through the frost. It was the first sign of new life in months. The sight filled him with a strange calm. The past had been unearthed, the dead named again, and the ground would heal in its own time. He turned to leave, but before reaching the gate he paused and looked back. The oak stood motionless, its branches etched against the pale sky. The light caught on the sap that had hardened along the wound, making it shine like glass. For the first time since he'd begun this job, he didn't see the tree as something to be felled. It was no longer an obstacle or a threat. It was a witness. It had done what people could not. It had kept a secret until someone was finally willing to listen. That night, back home, Jonathan sat by the fire, the warmth thawing the chill that had lived in him since the first day at the cemetery. He thought of writing down everything he had learned, but the idea felt unnecessary. The truth was already there, woven into the roots and the soil, recorded in a language older than ink. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the flicker of the flames, and whispered the name once under his breath. Henry Mason. Outside, the wind moved gently through the bare branches, carrying the faintest sound, a whisper or perhaps just the sigh of air passing through wood. He couldn't tell which. Either way, he felt no fear. The silence the tree had kept for so long was broken now, not by violence, but by remembrance. And in that quiet, he understood that some things are meant to be uncovered, no matter how deep they're buried. Spring came slowly to the valley that year, as though the earth itself hesitated to move on. The snow that had buried the cemetery through winter melted into long veins of water that ran between the graves, carrying with them the dark scent of thawed soil and moss. The air grew softer day by day, filled with the muted hum of insects waking beneath the dead leaves. Jonathan found himself drawn back to the cemetery again and again, long after the authorities had finished their work and the newspapers had stopped mentioning the story. He told himself it was habit, the same way a man might revisit a completed job to make sure everything was done right. But the truth went deeper than that. Something in him couldn't let the place go, not yet. He drove out one morning in early March when the frost still glittered on the grass and the air held a lingering bite. The gate creaked when he pushed it open, the hinges rusted by months of damp. Beyond it, the graves lay in quiet rows, the edges of their stones softened by the melt. At the far end of the plot, the oak still stood. Its great trunk had darkened to the color of old iron, and the scar that marked its hollow had hardened into a pale ridge that caught the light like bone. Around its roots, the ground had been leveled and smoothed by the city crew that came in January to finish the site's restoration. They had removed the plastic sheets, filled in the trenches left by the forensic dig, and placed a temporary barrier around the base to keep visitors from disturbing the area. As Jonathan walked closer, he noticed small green shoots pushing through the soil near the roots, tiny blades of grass and the first wildflowers of the season. He paused beside the fence and looked up. The branches above were still bare, but their tips glowed faintly red where new buds were forming. Despite everything, the oak had survived the winter. It stood thinner now, hollowed and scarred, yet somehow more alive than it had been before. The town council had finally made its decision. The oak would remain where it stood, no longer condemned as a hazard, but preserved as a historical monument. The remains of Henry Mason had been formally reinterred at the base of the tree, marked with a small bronze plaque that read simply, Henry Mason, 1872-1912. He kept watch. The simplicity of the words suited him. There was no mention of the circumstances, no hint of the horror that had surrounded his death, but to those who knew the story, the inscription was enough. Jonathan had attended the quiet ceremony 2 weeks earlier. A priest from the local parish had spoken briefly, his breath visible in the cold air, while 2 workers lowered the small casket containing Mason's bones into the earth. The investigator was there as well, standing at a distance with her hands in her pockets. The old woman who tended the graves came too, holding a bunch of white lilies wrapped in newspaper. She placed them beside the casket when the dirt was filled in and whispered something Jonathan couldn't hear. When the service ended, everyone drifted away in silence. Now, standing before the tree again, he felt a sense of completion mixed with something harder to name. He reached out and touched the rough bark. It was cool under his fingers, ridged and uneven like scar tissue. The wound that had once opened into the hollow was sealed now, though the outline remained visible, a faint memory of violence and revelation. Beneath his hand, he could feel the slow pulse of life running through the wood, the steady movement of water rising from root to branch. The oak was breathing again. He stepped back and let his gaze wander across the cemetery. The ground was dotted with patches of melting snow, each reflecting the pale sky like fragments of a broken mirror. Birds were returning, sparrows darting between the stones, crows perching on the iron fence. The place felt changed, not brighter exactly, but quieter in a different way. The unease that had once hung over it like a fog had lifted, Even the air smelled cleaner, as if the earth itself had exhaled. In town, the story of the oak had already begun to fade into local lore. People spoke of it as the watchman's tree, but few knew the details. The newspaper clippings yellowed in shop windows, and the city workers replaced the warning signs with a simple plaque explaining that the site was under preservation. Some of the older residents still crossed themselves when they passed the road that led to the cemetery, but their fear had softened into respect. Time was already doing its work, turning history into memory, and memory into silence again. Jonathan didn't mind. The truth didn't need to be shouted. It had been buried for 100 years. Now it had simply been given a name. That was enough. He had kept the journal of Henry Mason with him since the day of the burial. The original returned to his care after the archives made their copy. Sometimes at night he would take it out and read a few lines, not to seek answers but to hear the man's voice again. Mason's handwriting was steady, almost elegant, even in the final pages where fear had taken hold. There was something comforting in that. The persistence of order in the face of chaos. On his next visit to the cemetery, Jonathan brought something with him. In his workshop, he had crafted a small wooden marker, carved from the same oak he had cut from the tree's fallen branches during the first excavation. He sanded it smooth, burned a simple inscription into its surface, and sealed it with oil. It wasn't official, just something he wanted to leave. When he reached the oak, he knelt beside the bronze plaque and placed the wooden piece in the soil just above it. It read, "He remembered what others forgot." The wind caught the edges of his coat as he stood, and for a moment the branches above him stirred, their movement whispering faintly like distant applause. He lingered there for a while, letting the quiet settle around him. The air was warmer than it had been all winter, and the ground beneath his boots felt soft again. He thought of all that had happened. The first day he came here with his saw, the metallic clang inside the wood, the smell of resin and decay, the bones pulled from the hollow. He thought of Mason's words about the earth remembering what men forget. It had seemed poetic when he first read it, but now he understood it in a deeper, more literal way. The land itself had preserved what conscience and justice had tried to bury. As the afternoon light shifted, he walked to the far edge of the cemetery where the newer graves began. The snow had melted completely here, leaving the soil dark and damp. He noticed the old caretaker's hut near the wall, its roof half collapsed, ivy curling around the doorframe. Inside, dust motes floated in the dim light filtering through a cracked window. A few tools still leaned against the wall, a rusted shovel, a lantern long gone dark. On the floor lay an empty bottle, its glass cloudy with age. Jonathan crouched and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Faint letters were etched into the glass near the base. Mason and Sons Bottling Company. He stared at the name for a moment, then smiled faintly. It was nothing, probably just coincidence, but it felt like the place's last quiet nod to the man who had watched over it once. When he stepped outside again, the sun was low on the horizon, and the light had turned golden. The oak's branches glowed faintly, their buds tipped with color. He walked back toward it, his footsteps leaving soft impressions in the thawing ground. The air carried the scent of wet bark and fresh growth. Standing before the tree one last time, he felt a strange peace. The story that had begun in secrecy and ended in revelation had come full circle, and what remained was neither horror nor mystery, but a kind of solemn grace. He knelt beside the base of the trunk, brushing away a thin layer of leaves. The roots beneath spread outward like the lines of a map, thick and intertwined, reaching in every direction. He thought of them as threads connecting everything, the dead to the living, the past to the present, one man's silence to another's discovery. The ground here had held too many secrets for too long, but now it was only earth again, ready to bear new life. As he rose, he noticed the small green sapling growing just a few feet away from the main trunk. It was slender and bright, its leaves the color of new copper. He hadn't seen it before. Perhaps it had sprouted from one of the acorns the birds dropped, or perhaps from the oak itself, sending out new life in answer to what had been lost. Either way, he decided to leave it. Some things needed no tending. They grew best on their own. When he finally turned to leave, the last light of the sun fell across the inscription on the plaque, making the letters shine. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the words themselves breathed. He kept watch. Jonathan took off his hat, not out of habit but respect, and whispered the name again, the way he had done so many times before. Henry Mason. As he walked back toward his truck, the wind picked up, rustling the young shoots at his feet. It carried with it the smell of thawing soil, of roots breaking free, of wood warming after a long sleep. The town would move on, the seasons would turn, and one day the story would fade entirely. But the oak would remain, its roots wrapped around the bones of history, its branches reaching toward the light. It would stand for another 100 years if left alone, bearing witness in silence as the world continued to forget and remember in equal measure. At the top of the hill, Jonathan turned for one last look. The cemetery lay quiet beneath the soft evening haze, the oak rising at its heart like a sentinel. Beyond it, the distant river caught the fading sunlight and shimmered. He felt the old ache of fatigue and satisfaction that came at the end of a long job well done. Only this time, the work wasn't wood or soil, it was truth. It had taken a lifetime of silence, a single cut of a saw, and the stubborn endurance of a tree to uncover it. He climbed into his truck and started the engine. As he drove away, the sky deepened to violet, and the first stars appeared. The road curved along the ridge, giving him one final glimpse of the oak through the rearview mirror, a dark silhouette against the pale horizon. For a moment, he imagined he saw a flicker of light near its base, as if someone had left a candle burning there. Then the turn in the road hid it from view. He didn't look back again. The story of the watchman was finished now, sealed not by the closing of a book, but by the steady work of time and the persistence of memory. The tree would stand, the ground would rest, and the man who had once kept watch would never be forgotten again. If this story kept you watching till the end, make sure to subscribe right now, because what's coming next will surprise you even more. Don't miss the next discoveries and true hidden stories waiting to be uncovered. Share this video with someone who loves a mystery, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?